Move your ass. All right, all right. I don't know who all is on yet, but bear with me just a second while we get set up here. All right, it is 12 o'clock. I am going to turn off the neat jazz that the Restream platform has. So, first of all, thanks for joining, those of you who are here. And I'm going to do a little intro as we go. I'm going to take this timer away because it is time to start this book launch and webinar event. So, first of all, thank you for showing up. I am nursing a little bit of a cold today, and so if my voice sounds a little rough, that's what's going on. Yeah, so I'm Alan Mueller, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about this new book. I'm going to tell you where it came from, and then we're going to peek inside the book, and we're going to look inside and kind of get a feel for what the book's all about. And so to start with, here's my intro. And those of you who already know me know that I spent 20 years in what we call student affairs. If you're unfamiliar with student affairs, it's the parts of colleges and universities that make the universities and colleges tick outside the classroom. So it's the residence hall staff. It's the folks who run the career center, the student activities office, the multicultural center, if those are still surviving. It's the fraternity and sorority life office and the club office and all those things that sort of help build community at college. So I spent a long time doing that. Along the way, I got some degrees. I've highlighted a few things because a few things are going to come up in this conversation today. In particular, my master's degree and my doctorate, because my master's degree was what's called college student development. So imagine if you want to be a college administrator, you don't go get an MBA because colleges aren't a business. I mean, parts of them are business-like, but you typically go get a degree in student affairs or college student development. And so imagine an MBA for college administrators that's very, very reliant on developmental psychology. How are first year students different than second year students? How are second year students different than third year students? How are the experiences of Latinx students different than the experience of white students, different than the experience of Black students at predominantly white institutions, at predominantly Black institutions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of developmental psychology and some understanding of leadership development. In my doctorate's in educational leadership. But my dissertation in particular, I'll talk about in a little bit. My dissertation was on student leadership programs. How do universities teach student leadership? I got to go to three amazing universities. One is University of South Florida in Tampa, which is a minority serving institution, a very high percentage of Latinx students. The next was Emory University in Atlanta, which is a predominantly white institution. And the third was Howard University in DC, which is a historically Black university. And so I got this amazing, I got grant funding for my whole dissertation. I got to travel to these places and study not only how they did their leadership training, but how they measured if it was effective and how they used those measures, or assessment as we call them, to make their programs better. You see some other things I did. I highlighted some of my experiences as well, because even though my student affairs journey, I traversed a lot of different what we call functional areas. Sometimes I was in career services, sometimes I was in activities, sometimes I was in intercultural student affairs. The most common thread is almost everywhere I went, I either ran a student leadership program, created and then ran a student leadership program, or resurrected and then ran a student leadership program. And so it was a passion of mine all along. And you'll pick up on that as we go, because that feeds into this book. Here's a little bit more fun stuff about me. Those of you who've seen me do keynotes and such, you know the numbers 2.16 and 7. 2.16 was my GPA when I finished college the first time, and 7 years is how long it took me. And so I don't want that last slide to make you think that I am an academic deep down in my bones, or that I'm super smart. I mean, I think I am a smart person, but this is a story. My educational journey is a story much more of perseverance than of smarts, if that makes any sense. Other things that make me me: I'm a big fan of drum and bugle corps. I like visiting Disney. Part of two fraternities. One's a band nerd fraternity. I'm not making that up. The other is the latest and greatest member of the Divine Nine, if you know what the Divine Nine is. then just don't worry. Don't adjust your screen. I'm a white man. If you don't know what the Divine Nine is, you can look it up. But the one I've got highlighted highlighted there is I was an improv comedian for 8 years at an amazing club called the Idiot Box. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that on our journey. Every presentation I do, I have this slide, and it's part of what makes me me. Is that if we're going to talk about leadership, if we're going to talk about comedy, if we're going to talk about the intersection of leadership and comedy, we're talking about it in a context where all of us have identities. I'm white, I'm a man, I'm cisgender, meaning when I was born, the doctor's like, it's a boy, and he happened to guess right. But doctors don't always guess right, you know. I'm not currently disabled. I'm middle class. I'm college educated. There's a lot of things that make me me. I don't ever get to leave any of those parts of me at home. I don't ever get to leave the house and go, I'm going to leave the white part of me at home. I'm going to leave the college educated part of me at home. So we all have intersecting identities. So I want to make sure that all my conversations continue this awareness. This isn't like a DEI training. I know some people get nervous and scared about that kind of stuff. Don't really know why once you start talking about it. However, I just want to make that point. Also, I show this logo to a lot of folks when I'm doing keynote speeches and workshops, the FedEx logo. I'm in Central North Carolina, and FedEx has a large presence here. And about 25 to 33% of every audience I address doesn't know that in the negative space between the E and the X in the FedEx logo, there's an arrow. So the negative space, if you look at the orange E and the orange X in the magnifying glass there on the screen, in the negative space between the E and the X, there's an arrow. And so I tell groups this because, again, about 25 to 33%, between a fourth and a third of every audience I speak to, has never noticed this before. And so my hope is that you get to notice something in today's webinar that you can't unnotice. Trust me, if today's the first day you've seen the FedEx arrow, you're never going to unsee it. You're going to be driving down the highway, like, yep, there it goes. Go get home, get a package from FedEx. You're going to be like, yep, there it is. You're always going to see it from this point forward. For blind people and also people with visual impairments, there's something called the Wilhelm scream. Trust me, everyone on this webinar right now has heard the Wilhelm scream probably 5 or 6 dozen times through your life in various movies. And until you know it's the Wilhelm scream, you don't. And if you Google the Wilhelm scream and listen to it as you're watching movies for in the future, even movies you've previously watched, you'll pick up on it. So my hope is that you get something today that you can't aha. You're going to get my hope is you get an aha moment you cannot aha. So to tell this story the right way, I'm sort of telling 2 different stories. So I got my little DeLorean here. We're going to go back and forth in time a little bit. First, I'm going to tell this story from 2009 to 2016. Then I'm going to go back in time and tell a story that's from 2005 to 2024. And then we're going to talk about the book. So the 2009 to 2016 is improv, how I got involved in improv and how that started changing my thinking some. The 2005 to 2024 story is how I got into leadership development and what that was like for me and how that evolved over time. And then we're just going to go straight into the book. So these stories are going to jump in time a little bit, but I feel like y'all are going to be okay. Yeah. So the improv story starts in 2009. I was running a career development center at a small college in Greensboro, North Carolina. It's called Guilford College, the only Quaker college in the South. And I was the director of the career development center. And we had professional conferences like anyone does. And one of the cool professional conferences that I went to was called NCACE, the North Carolina Association of Colleges and Employers. Great, great, great organization. Part of the thing I loved about this organization is many conferences I went to were just people in my industry. So many of the career conferences I would go to would just be fellow career coaches, career counselors, and directors of career centers. What made NCACE extra cool was it was the North Carolina Association of Colleges and Employers. So when I was hanging out there, I would estimate maybe 65%, maybe 70% of the membership were career coaches and career counselors at colleges and universities like me, but the rest were employers, recruiters. So that gave the conference a different feel, a different vibe. I used to joke with people, it's the first student affairs conference I ever attended where there was a hospitality suite in which there was a bathtub full of beer. So really, really cool organization. In 2009, their conference was in Wilmington, North Carolina on the coast. And it was the 40th anniversary of this organization. And so rather than the traditional setup where they have an opening keynote speaker, a bunch of breakout sessions, and a closing keynote speaker, They replaced one of those keynote speakers. I think it was the opening keynote speaker. They replaced them with an improv troupe from Wilmington. So they took however many of us were there. I think there were probably about 200 or so people there, broke us into two large ballrooms and had half of the improv troupe go to one room and half the other. And I remember this pretty vividly. They explained some of how improv worked. They asked for some volunteers, and I volunteered to do a scene. Also, my good friend and colleague Eddie, who at the time worked at NC State University, I think still does. Eddie was my scene partner, and we knew each other from the conference scene. And Eddie was a cool guy, and we'd hung out and stuff. But we did the scene together. I don't remember everything about the scene, but what I do remember is that Eddie and I think, were business partners. I think that we owned a Waffle House together, and one of us was accusing the other of us of doing something with the other one's wife, and there ended up being a stabbing in the improv scene, right? So this was a scene that I remember, and even though I don't remember everything about the scene, what I do remember is it challenged my mind to operate differently. It challenged my mind to think in a way that I hadn't previously, or maybe I had previously, but not in any kind of formal way, not in any kind of structured way. And it made me think a little differently about my own thinking. So this goes back to 2009 in that conference. Some of you that were alive and watching television in the 80s may remember this commercial. You got your peanut butter in my chocolate. There's like a guy walking down the street with a chocolate bar and a woman walking up the street with an open jar of peanut butter, like we've all done, I think, from time to time, walking down the street with an open jar of peanut butter. And they bump into each other, right? And the line is, you got your chocolate on my peanut butter. You got your peanut butter on my chocolate. And then Reese's peanut butter cups are born. It's hard for me to imagine, but there was a world that existed before Reese's peanut butter cups, right? That we all knew about chocolate and we all knew about peanut butter. But until somebody thought, wait a second, what if these two ideas could work together? What if this thing that usually is by itself and this other thing that's usually by itself, what if we could put them together into a really good combo? That's when Reese's peanut butter cups were born. So that kind of thinking, some people call it divergent thinking or lateral thinking, but the idea of, are there some things that people generally don't think of as related that put together in combination could be cool, have synergy? I honestly, if somebody said, hey, do you want a tablespoon of peanut butter or a little chocolate bar or a Reese's peanut butter cup, I'm gonna take the Reese's peanut butter cup, y'all. I mean, so as I was thinking about this improv experience, and as I was running this career development centers, y'all, they're not glamorous typically. They're not sexy and exciting typically, right? Career centers at your colleges and university campuses are the places you go. Students are working on their resumes, they're applying for internships, they're getting coaching on how to do effective interviews, they're preparing statements of purpose to apply to graduate school. So it's this department that helps students with transitions into the post-college world. And sometimes that's careers, sometimes it's a life of service, sometimes it's further study. Whatever it is, the job of a career development center is to help them get there. And so we were constantly in our career development center trying to think of creative ways to get more students engaged. And so after this conference and after I had that experience, my brain was spinning. I was like, how can I use this? And I think it was maybe 2 weeks later, we had like career readiness week. And a lot of career centers do this like once a year. They'll have a week where they'll do robust programming. They'll have 2 resume workshops. They'll have a dress for success workshop. They'll have a how to interview workshop. They'll do a lot of sort of concentrated promotional effort in 1 week to try to get students more involved. And as the director, I'm looking around and I'm seeing these programs that my amazing team is doing. And I'm realizing that one of them, the interview prep, it hit me like a lightning bolt that every interview that you'll ever do in your entire life is improvisational, right? Nobody gives you questions ahead of time. There's no script for a job interview. So when I came back and I saw that, I created this course. I created a course called Improv Comedy and the Art of the Job Interview. I've also done this in workshop format with a few different clients, including Duke University. I worked with some engineering students at Duke several years ago when I was working on this class. And here's some pictures of my class. And they taught me a lot. Little side note, just in terms of my own growth and development. If you've ever taught in a college or university or taught in a middle school or a high school, sometimes students that have special needs might have an individualized education program or a 504 program, or in colleges and universities, sometimes a letter from the dean's office indicating that there might be a student in your class that needs additional support to be successful in the class. And so oftentimes I would get a letter saying this student needs an environment free of distraction. And so, an improv comedy class could kind of be called Distraction 101. So I had some anxiety about this, particularly because the college where I worked was a autism spectrum friendly campus. We had a lot of autistic students at our college. And the first time that an autistic student signed up for my class, I had some biases and some anxieties I needed to work through. And oh my goodness, did I work through them? And I want to thank those students for helping me work through them, because overwhelmingly, and this is just a side note, I found on balance that the students who were autistic or experiencing autism, and I know there's a variety of opinions on the term that's preferred, but the autistic students overwhelmingly on balance were the best improvisers of any, far better than the quote unquote neurotypical students, which definitely challenged some of my preconceptions, and it was a lot of growth for me. But anyway, the class was cool. We would take field trips, and on the field trips we would go down to the comedy club. I should mention the comedy club. Hey, so when I got back from that conference, I kind of caught the bug, and I thought, well, can I find a class? And so I took this class at a local comedy club called the Idiot Box. My teacher was this person, Jenny Stencil. And you're going to hear about Jenny's husband in a little bit, but I don't know if y'all remember on that previous slide, 5 slides ago or whatever, I got a lot of degrees, y'all, and I've spent a lot of time in formal education. And Jenny Stencil is seriously one of the best educators I know. And when you're teaching something that's experiential in nature, sort of lab work, improv comedy is lab work, and also it's experiential in so much as people have to practice it, fail, get corrected, then practice it, then fail, then get corrected. And it takes a lot of nuance and grace and knowing when to push and when to not and whatever. And Jenny is just brilliant at this. And so, and I'm going to talk a little bit about her husband too. He's also brilliant at this too. But Jenny in particular, on the teaching side of things, is just an exceptional teacher. So I just want to say that, and pushed me. And I took the improv class, and then I finished, and I said, is there a part 2? She said, yeah, there is a part 2, but maybe they didn't have enough people for the part 2. She said, just come hang out with the troupe for a while, come to rehearsals, and we'll see if you kind of fit in and work you in. And then I went, and I probably, I don't even remember, maybe 7, 8, 9 months I was part of the troupe, but not in the shows, because I still had a lot to learn. Even when I got in the shows, there were probably a solid 2 years when I was messing up more than helping out. And so really, really great environment at the Idiot Box. And Jenny was an exceptional teacher. And Steve, her husband, was an exceptional teacher. And I'm going to talk about him in a little bit. So now that you know a little bit of my improv story, found out about it at this conference, found a comedy club, took a class. Now we're going to go back in time. So that was 2009 to 2015-ish. Now we're going to go back to 2005, 2006. I'm going to tell you a little bit about leadership development and how I got into leadership development. So that's a picture of me as a grad student. So that picture, I think, is from probably 2002, maybe something like that. I was getting a master's degree in college student development, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. But around 2005, 2006, Gmail was already kicking by that point. I think we had in 2004, Gmail showed up. And I had been working as a graduate student with a leadership program. It was called Emerging Leaders. Shortly after that, I got my first job at a college, a small college called Lees McRae College. And I started a leadership program there called Kibo. Kibo is the last hut before the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro. And that particular college, the mission was about the mountains. The motto was in the mountains, of the mountains, for the mountains. So we wanted a strong mountain metaphor. So the Kibo leadership program. After Kibo, at my next college, I did something called Peaks, the Peaks leadership program. After that, at my next college, I did something called Sprout, the Sprout Emerging Leader Program. After that, I did one called Leaders in Training, LIT. The person who came up with the name with me, I said, you know that in a few years, people aren't going to be saying LIT. She goes, don't worry, it's still Leaders in Training, right? But the bottom line is I started getting involved in these emerging leader programs, mostly for first-year students. But around 2005, around 2005, 2006, I had this idea that maybe one day I might want to write a book about leadership. It was very amorphous in my head. So I created this email address called allensleadershipbook@gmail.com. And every time I saw an example of good leadership or bad leadership or particularly potent or effective leadership or ineffective leadership, and I'm talking about whether it was my boss or supervisor, whether it was someone at the university where I was working, whether it was a politician in my state or at the national level, or faith leaders or civic leaders or whoever was occupying leadership positions. I started taking notes, kind of taking notes on my observations of leadership. And whenever I would take a note, I would just send it to this email address. And just it's funny because I'd sent it to this email address for the better part of 16 years and never opened it. Never opened it. Like 17, maybe 17 years of emails where it's just these little anecdotes. And I sent those all to myself, and it was interesting. And before you know it, I went and got a doctorate, 2010 to 2015. My dissertation was on, if you want the formal title, first year co-curricular non-positional emerging leader program. So first years for first year students, co-curricular. None of the programs I was studying gave course credit because there was always this belief that some research pointed to that said for a leadership program to be good, it had to have a connection to the curriculum. And I had seen really cool leadership programs that didn't give students credit. So I was like, maybe I should explore if that's just me, if it's just the one place where I am, or the several places I was at by this point, or if this is more of a phenomenon that I could look at other universities, whether there are programs that didn't give course credit where students wanted to learn about leadership just to learn about leadership. So I did that dissertation, got to travel all over the country, and it was really, really cool. University of South Florida in Tampa, Emory in Atlanta, and Howard up in DC. I got my doctorate in 2015. Fast forward to 2023, and I finally really opened up that email and started sifting through all those stories. And then I wrote a book called Leading with Emotional Intelligence. And I wish I could say that all those stories are in the book. It's nowhere close. It's nowhere close. The stories, all those stories and observations together, goodness, I mean, it could be 10 books. But the other thing that's interesting is I could tell which Alan had written these. In other words, I could tell Alan with a master's degree who was doing leadership programs with students was writing about leadership in a certain way, making observations in a certain way. When I went to get my ed specialist degree, which was in between my master's and doctorate, that Alan had some new revelations about leadership, and he was writing about things in a slightly different way. By the time I was had a role as a supervisor in student affairs, so this was around 2010, and when I was a director and then eventually an assistant dean, I had new kinds of reflections about leadership, and somehow some parts of leadership are lonely and some parts of it are isolating. And so it's interesting because from time to time, I would just send an email to this email, and it would, I mean, sometimes it would be one time and then not again for a year. And then sometimes it would be a 3-month span and I'd send 20 in those 3 months. But the bottom line is that I imagined one day I might write a leadership book. And so I did. So this book came out earlier this year, Leading with Emotional Intelligence. And I'm very, very proud of it. It's self-published. I did some publishing in academia world where you have to, convince editors of refereed or peer-reviewed journals to accept your stuff. Had a little bit of success. I'm not an academic deep down in my bones, but I got a few things published in that traditional way. And because of that, I think I was sort of acculturated or sort of taught that was the only right way to publish. And at some point, when I started putting this book together, I was like, maybe there's another way. And actually, the forward of that book was written by a dear friend and colleague who's also sort of a mentor to me, named Dr. Kelly Dixon. People call her Dr. K. And at some point, Dr. K, we were having lunch, and she said, Alan, you can let yourself be the source this time. And I think what she was implying is, dude, you've been working in leadership development for 25 years. You wrote a dissertation about leadership. You do leadership training all over the country. You are your own source, and you don't have to always think in the academic frame. So wrote that book. Weaving the threads together, now after I did student affairs for 20 years, I went and became a consultant. And this is just a small sampling of my clients. I literally go all over the country now. Just in the last 30 days, I've been in Long Beach, California, Wilkesboro, North Carolina, Orlando, Florida, Richmond, Virginia, Greensboro, North Carolina, and that's in the last 30 days. And so a lot of traveling. But I get to work with amazing teams, and it's city and municipal governments, it's college and university leaders, sometimes it's student leaders, it's corporate leaders, a lot more corporate. And also in this picture, something exciting, as I built my company, for the first maybe 6 years, my company, Adaptive Challenge Consulting, was just the Alan Show. So Alan was Adaptive adaptive challenge consulting and vice versa. And then in around 2001, I started connecting with some really talented folks. And so on the bottom right, you see some of the folks you see in the large boardroom. That's Dr. K doing her work with one of our clients. And then the bottom right with me with the picture of the three women, that's Dr. Christy Walker, that's Sarah Dumas, and that's Taishay Lewis. And so these are folks that I've worked with different clients. And yeah, there's a few affiliates not pictured: Chris Haig, Anthony Brumfield, our newest, Dre Deming. And Dr. Dre Deming, just finished taking her first improv class at the Idiot Box. And I went back to that comedy club to take it with her just in solidarity. And so got to kind of re-experience what the class was like that I had taken, I don't know how long ago, with my colleague, Dr. Deming, which was really, really cool. But so this is the timeline, right? Sending myself these emails about leadership, to running emerging leader programs, that's the EL, to writing a dissertation, to eventually crafting a minor in leadership studies at Guilford College, where I was. And it was supposed to be a temporary minor. They had a way that you could do a minor for one little cohort. And I think from what I read, they ended up keeping it. And now I do corporate leadership development. And so lots of transition in terms of leadership. But the bottom line is, as long as colleges and universities need students to lead, and as long as, I always joke with people that as long as businesses as long as there are bad bosses in the world, bad supervisors in the world, this work will be important. And so now probably 60% of the clients, maybe more at this point, of my clients are corporate clients. And so they are companies, and you wouldn't believe the scope and range of companies. It's logistics companies, law offices. One of my clients is a flavor company that has like 240 versions of vanilla. I mean, it's amazing how broad the world is. One of my clients that I was working with in Orlando is a leadership association for people in the pest management world. People who do pest management, their leaders and the owners of those companies get together, and I do work with them on leadership as well. So lots of diversity. But what's the next light bulb moment though, right? So we're getting from, okay, I took improv comedy and career services, kind of mashed those up in the chocolate and peanut butter thing. By the way, if you actually remember this commercial, by the way, probably time to call your dermatologist, just saying. Yeah. Because you're probably of an age. So using the skills that I learned doing improv, those skills have made me a better facilitator. When I was getting my graduate degrees and also doing a lot of practical things in terms of internships and running these emerging leader programs, I learned a lot about experiential education, pedagogy, and technique. I used something called the Kolb cycle of experiential learning a lot. I use different developmental lenses to think about who I'm speaking to get closer to getting the learning to be as sticky as possible. So there's all of this rich developmental and pedagogical stuff that's been rattling around in my brain since about 2003. And now there's this rich improv comedy stuff of how do you establish presence on a stage? How do you work while thinking quickly and improvising with a team to reach team goals? And so there's this whole second set of things that I'm juggling in my brain. And what I don't think I realized at the time is that as those things both went with me everywhere I went, eventually I became a way better public speaker. Public speaking for many people is terrifying. Jerry Seinfeld once famously said the number one fear in the US is public speaking. The number two fear is death. So his punchline is, at the average funeral, most of us would prefer to be in the casket than giving the eulogy, right? That public speaking is that scary. One of my clients, I mentioned Wilkesboro, I'm working with a community college, and their quality enhancement plan, and colleges and universities every 5 years have to work towards improving some aspect of their work. They call it a quality enhancement plan, or QEP. Their quality enhancement plan at this particular institution is about teaching their students to be better public presenters and communicators. So I'm loving this engagement because I'm getting to teach about what I do and pick it apart in those ways. And we're using some improv along the way. So I've been using these improv skills. I tell people sometimes that in my improv troupe, right? And I use the basketball analogy. I'm a big basketball fan. If my improv team was, a prolific college basketball team like a Duke or a UNC or a Kentucky or a Kansas, if we were a prolific basketball team, I was definitely not a starter at the comedy club, right? I wasn't the water boy, right? I wasn't that guy where the last one that gets in that everybody goes crazy about, but I was definitely seventh or eighth in their rotation, right? There were significant folks who'd been doing it longer, and some who had not been doing it longer, who were just better at improv than me, and that's okay, right? I don't have an ego when it comes to that. But if you're the seventh or eighth best improv person in a troupe, and it's a really good troupe with really good teachers like Jenny and her husband Steve, and then you happen to be a keynote speaker, you're a darn. Most people don't expect keynotes to be funny, and so once you've done your 50th scene about Nicki Minaj and Beyonce arm wrestling to see who gets to go on vacation to Costa Rica with Joe Biden, or whatever random stuff we've come up with, the mental tools that you need to do an effective keynote speech and to really reach an audience are just sharpened and increased and improved. And so even though I think as an improv comedian, I'm definitely a seventh or eighth option off the bench, when it comes to how that has impacted how I do workshops and how I do keynotes, it has elevated me in the keynote realm to a starter. And so understanding these techniques has helped me be a much, much better and more comfortable presenter. But using the techniques and teaching about them are two different things. So the next light bulb moment came with this unusual invitation. There's this group called the Center for Creative Leadership. They're like an international leadership organization. Sometimes I joke with people that the Center for Creative Leadership, if they are Dr. Pepper, my company, Adaptive Challenge Consulting, is Dr. Thunder, meaning we're sitting next to them on the shelf. Many of the ingredients are pretty similar. They are a global brand. We are not yet. And so, but a lot of the work they do with clients is very similar to the work we do with clients. A lot of the credentials of the people on their team are very similar to the credentials of the people on our team. They've just been doing this for a long time, and they have a global reach, and they're an amazing, amazing organization. And so I was invited through a weird set of circumstances to come in and do an in-service for their faculty. And so they have faculty and staff who serve different clients, and they wanted me to talk about how improv comedy could specifically help them with executive presence or leadership presence. Now, if you don't know that term, executive presence or leadership presence, it's about when your leader gets up in front of the room, can she or he or they command a room effectively? Are they confident in their own skin? Are they able to slow down when they need to and speed up when they need to communicate effectively? And so some people call it executive presence. I have a love-hate relationship with that phrase because I understand what they mean. I think leadership presence is a phrase I'm more comfortable with. But I came in to do that workshop on leadership presence, and it was really, really cool. But that's when it gets really interesting. The group that I did the workshops for was sort of their domestic division, the group that serves a lot of clients domestically here in the US. But apparently the email that had gone out that said, hey, we have somebody who's done improv comedy who's coming in to do this. Apparently that email had reached some of the people who worked with their international clients. And I got a call from one of them, and we started talking about, could I work with them in some of these larger programs internationally to increase leadership presence. And as the conversation went, one of the questions was, they asked me, well, who else do you know who has these credentials in leadership and this experience with leadership education, who's also done some improv comedy work? And I was like, I don't know anybody. Nobody. Like the people at my comedy club, it's funny, my comedy club, shocking amount of PhDs, but it's like British literature. It was like geology. The owner of the club, Steve of the Jenny and Steve combo, he was the owner at the time. I think Jenny's the owner now. But his PhD, I think it's neurobiology, right? But they were looking for, who do you know out there who's studied leadership in a really in-depth way, who also has an improv background? And the implication was, if I could find a team that maybe we could sort of work out a collaboration. And I can't find anybody. And so that was the next light bulb moment for me. And the light bulb moment was, I should write a book. And so here's the book. I've foreshadowed this guy showing up, Dr. Steve Lesser. Again, I'm pretty sure his PhD is like in neurobiology. I think that's right. And he has a day job that's not about comedy, but also runs a comedy club, teaches stand-up comedy and sketch comedy and improv comedy, and was very, very gracious, and offered to write the foreword for my book. I approached him and said, "Would you write the foreword to my book?" And he graciously said yes. And so yeah, so I started thinking, how could I deconstruct some of this, right? I'm using improv comedy techniques all the time when I'm doing a workshop, I'm using them all the time when I'm doing a keynote speech. But could I deconstruct it? Could I pull it together and lay it out in a way that might make sense for people who are curious about the connection, curious about how one can increase the other? And not just that, but learning about improv comedy, even when I'm not doing workshops or even when I'm not doing keynotes, when I was simply leading a team and supervising people, some of the techniques that I was learning in improv comedy helped me. They helped me be more patient. They helped me give more grace. They helped me be more aware and listen more closely. So I'm going to take you into a little bit about this book. So, but again, real quick shout out to Dr. Steve Lesser, who wrote the foreword. Great guy, great educator. And when he and his wife teach together, y'all, it is magic. It's like peanut butter and chocolate, y'all. It's like this is they're magic, especially together. They're magic. So this is a little bit about the book. So the first chapter is about the rules of improv. So if you get this book, or when you get this book, I promise, I say, you're not going to read this first chapter and at your company or your high school or your university or your town government or your city government, you're not going to finish this chapter and go, oh, let's start an improv troupe, right? It's not going to be that in depth. And two, one of the things that one needs to understand is that this is a performance skill. So I could give you 5 different books about playing the clarinet, but if I don't give you a clarinet and give you feedback and instruction, and if you don't get to practice, fail, succeed, practice more, fail, succeed, practice more, if you don't get that real world hands-on experience, it's going to be hard to really, really learn. However, there is something that you can learn from reading about the techniques, right? And so my hope is that this first chapter in particular, it's a little bit about how do you do improv, but in each instance, I try to pull out little lessons that also parallel leadership. So, for example, listening is one of the fundamental parts of both improv comedy and leadership. As a matter of fact, in my other book, I use an acronym, LEADING, and I have a love-hate relationship with acronyms, and so I entered into that acronym very, very cautiously. But L is listening. I think fundamental to all leadership is really, really listening to people, employing active listening, and then also making people feel heard, which is a different skill set. The saying yes and, that yes and is in a lot of ways about making people feel heard, right? You've listened. Now I'm going to say yes, and I'm going to affirm what you just said for your scene start in an improv scene. And then I'm going to add an and to it, and I'm going to add something to it. So if your offer for the improv scene, if we're 2 people in an improv scene, and if you've ever seen improv comedy, you'll often see 2 or 3 people on stage, sometimes 4. And if 2 of us are in an improv scene and scene partner 1 says to me, honey, I don't care what your mom says. I think it is too expensive. In that one offer, they've established that whoever we are to each other, we are honey to each other, probably a couple of some kind. That we're a couple to the point where that person knows my mom, and that my mom has said something, and that my partner, my significant other, has said, I don't care what your mom says, it's too expensive. So they've given this rich world. So first I have to listen, because if I don't listen, I might not catch that we are a couple, that we're the kind of couple where they would know my mom, implying maybe we're a married couple, and that there's some kind of thing where my spouse and my mom disagree about how expensive something is, right? If I don't listen, I miss out on all of that. My yes and, if I say yes, if I'm like, well, yeah, I don't care what my mother thinks either, that's just a yes. That's not a yes and. But if I say, yeah, no, I get it, but our daughter really, really wants to play trumpet for the long haul. She just made all county band. She's really good at it, and I think it's worth the investment, right? Where I've taken the yes, this thing where she has a conflict with my mother-in-law, and I've inserted an and to it, where I've named the thing that's too expensive is a trumpet, and I've added to the drama that we have a daughter maybe, and that daughter really wants to play trumpet, and that I want the daughter to have this trumpet even if it's expensive. So the listening is the first part because you have to catch those details. But then the yes and is after I've heard that, I need to give something back to them that shows them, yes, I heard you. And here's the new part of the story I'm going to add. Y'all, this is the same as in leadership. It really is, which is if you're listening effectively, making sure that the person that you're listening to, that you let them know you are listening, let them know that they are heard, using phrases like, I hear you, I understand. Side note, but I do a lot of work with extroversion and introversion. And the Myers-Briggs type indicator is controversial, but when used right, it's used wrong a lot, but when it's used right, it can be a very powerful tool for leadership development. And I tell people that listening is a skill that people with introvert preferences and people with extrovert preferences still have to learn. Everybody has to learn how to be an active listener. In general, people with an introvert preference are going to have a slightly easier time learning that skill, I think. And there's some reasons for that. But when it comes time to, after you've listened, to make the person across from you feel heard, feel affirmed, externally process that you heard them, the people who sorry, just got a phone call. The people who are can learn that a little more quickly tend to be the people with the extrovert preferences because they tend to naturally process externally. And so that's one of those things that it immediately translates over to leadership. There's more to how improv works: building up, not breaking down, getting on the same page. Getting on the same page requires listening to each other, because again, in that scene start that I mentioned, if my scene partner says, honey, I don't care what your mother says, I think it's too expensive, and then I say back, you know what, you didn't take the dog out and now he's pooped on the carpet, I'm not getting on the same page. I'm making a whole new scene that's about different stuff, right? And so so understand that a lot of these lessons sort of have a natural kind of connection with leadership. Avoiding questions, establishing the settings, everyone participates, care about something. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is a little bit just about leadership. It's about leadership. It's about me taking decades of reading about what leadership is. I mean, I've read, there's a million models out there. In college campuses, universities, the social change leadership model is very popular. Kouzes and Posner is another model that I really, really like. But then you also have the kind of those leadership writers, the Stephen Coveys of the world, the John Maxwell's, those folks. And so when you go and write a dissertation about leadership, your chapter 2 of your dissertation is what's called a literature review, and you have to kind of turn over all the stones, so to speak. You have to read enough of all of the books that there's nothing that you've missed if you're going to talk about different leadership concepts and theories, because then the people on your committee will say, oh, you missed the theory by so and so. So it's not like I've read every single leadership book known to humankind, but let me say it this way: when your dissertation is on how do colleges and universities teach leadership to students, I had to get a very, very broad view of the leadership literatures out there and what makes leadership leadership. So chapter 2, I sort of distill some of that, the idea of trait theory, the idea of developmental psychology. The number 2, and this is one of the things I like to share with people, because people who don't know what developmental psychology is, it takes some explanation sometimes. And one of the ways I explain it, I call it monsters under the bed and other lessons from development. When I was 4 or 5 years old, I was thoroughly convinced there was a monster under my bed. I was scared of that. That fear was real. That I was scared there was a monster under my bed, or maybe a monster in the closet or something like that. By the time I was a teenager, 13, 14, 15, I was no longer scared that there were monsters under my bed. I was no longer scared of that. I did have new fears, though. My new fears were about being accepted by my peer group. My new fears were about passing tests. My new fears were about asking someone out. I had a new set of fears. And so in this new set of fears, that means I've reached a new phase of development, if that makes sense. And so developmental psychology is not that we get smarter as we age. It's that our thinking gets more complex. Our thinking gets more complex and nuanced as we grow and develop. And so when you think about leadership development, when you think about what makes that work, there's this, you can do checkbox leadership, right? You can get a book that says, do these 10 things and you'll be a leader. But if you're not changing internally, if you're not making more meaning in more complex way about how you're leading, then it's only surface level leadership. And so I think that there are out there folks who think if you just check this list and have these traits, you are a leader. And there are other folks who say, yes, you need to exhibit these traits. But if these traits aren't coming from an authentic place where you are growing and developing and learning and humble in your own leadership journey, then it's performative, and it's not sort of embodied leadership, right? When I went and spoke with my colleagues at Center for Creative Leadership, the embodied leadership idea was something that they talked about as being part of leadership presence, embodied leadership, that there's sort of that there's integrity in terms of how you think and are as a leader. And so this chapter 2 gets into that. I also talk about managing emotions. This is one of those things, excuse me, this is one of those things that's in my first book, because if you right now went on the internet and looked up what is emotional intelligence or what is emotionally intelligent leadership, if you look that up right now, on many of those lists, you're going to find managing emotions as a core component of emotionally intelligent leadership. I understand where that comes from, and I'm not saying that managing your emotions is bad. I'm not saying that. But saying managing emotions is sort of pretending that our workspaces are not full of multiple cultures and not full of dominant cultures. So, prior to World War II, so most of the workforce of the United States were white people. So much of the workforce was white people. Management were overwhelmingly white men. We can trace back to the Industrial Revolution. And then in World War II, the GI Bill, which was a largely unfulfilled promise, but in fits and spurts, it helped more Black people and Latin people get into the workforce. Rosie the Riveter, if you're familiar with that iconic picture of Rosie the Riveter, was a symbol of women entering the workforce in big new ways, in roles that they hadn't previously envisioned themselves as part of, right? Society had been telling women for a long time in the United States, you've got some great options. It's nurse, school teacher, or stay-at-home mom. Those are your options, right? There were these societal expectations of where women fit in the world of work. And then when World War II happened, suddenly it's like, hey, have you ever thought about welding? Hey, have you thought about engineering? Hey, have you thought about these other things? So when you look at all those things that were happening in the US around World War II, there was this shift happening. This managing emotions, to me, is a misogynistic remnant of the pre-World War II understanding of what professional means. In other words, if I had a time machine, and if women women primarily, and then also Black women and other women of color, were setting the work norms and standards in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, if I had a time machine and could go change it, there's certain things about what we consider professional that might not have ever entered our consciousness. And one of those, I think, is managing emotions. Managing emotions, to me, is men are in supervisory positions, men are in CEO positions, men are in vice president positions. And as more women and as people who weren't white started entering the workforce in new ways with their own cultural and social norms, that these men were like, yeah, no, you need to manage your emotions, and because we have certain norms that we've established as white guys, and we want you to fit those norms. And so again, there's a kind of a culturally contextual thing here that it always bothered me whenever I see this on lists, that managing emotions, and I get it. And outside of this, managing your emotions is a good thing. Like, let's put a pin in that. Let's put it over to the side. Managing your emotions is important. But in the first book, I talk about really what we're talking about is navigating the emotional expectations of others. Navigating that managing emotions is something you have to do to acclimate. Navigating the expectations of others is much more real, I think, of the conversation. So chapter 2 is about leadership. Chapter 3 is where I try to bring it together. It's, going back to that listening and building on ideas and shifting perspective. Position on stage. When you're on stage in an improv comedy club, you don't want your back to the audience, and people who do traditional theater, they do something called blocking, where they get to memorize where they go, where they stand, so that they're not in front of someone blocking a view. They have a director, and the director has a stage picture of what she wants on the stage and is able to tell you where to go. With improv, you don't have that. There's no little stickers on the floor that tells you stand here for this part of the scene, because you don't even know what this part of the scene is. You're making it all up as you go. So you have to be aware of, are you standing in front of someone? Are you upstaging someone? Are you blocking a view? Is your body, is the way you're using your body, does it make sense for the scene? And then we can carry that over to a metaphor, to an analogy about when you're in a leadership role. Do you always insist on being up front, being in front of the group? Is the only mode of leadership hierarchical, where you are not just in front, but where you operate as though you are above, because on an org chart you show up above those you are leading? Or do you adopt other modes of leadership that are more collegial, that are more democratized, that are more consensus based? And or as a leader, do you sometimes do one and sometimes the other? Do some of the decisions that your team and you are making call for consensus? Do some call for democratization? Do some call for kind of an authoritative making the call? One of the things I tell people is, if I'm, that each of these modes of leadership has a place, but oftentimes we don't discuss these different modes in a way that's intentional so that we can know we're using these different modes in the best place. So, for example, I spent a lot of time with the Quakers, and philosophically, I consider myself a Quaker. The Quakers are known for reaching consensus. As a Quaker elder once told me, when we've sat in a room for multiple hours where we don't vote to see who has the majority, but we reach consensus, and it takes a long time, a Quaker elder once told me consensus means we've all left equally unsatisfied with the decision and equally committed to the decision. And so it's a really different sort of standard. Trust me when I say, if I ever am on an emergency room table and a doctor is operating on me, I do not want her to say, hey, time out, let's get some consensus on this dude's spleen. No, 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 no. I want her to just fix me, sew me up, get me good, right? But then there are other instances where democratization and consensus and other things matter. And so position on stage is a great analogy for this. Cultural awareness too. And in my first book, there's a lot about cultural humility, cultural awareness, starting with being able to laugh at your own culture. For me, what is it about whiteness that I think is funny? What is it about dude culture that I think is funny? Do I reflect on seeing people's culture? I'm a seeing person. I can see. I don't know that I've ever reflected on that as a culture. Whereas I think the blind community, because they know the parameters, is they're the blind community in a world that's otherwise full of people who are seeing people. Do I ask myself these questions about the cultures I'm part of? Some of those cultures are easy to name. Some of them are harder to name. I'm part of hearing culture. I'm part of not currently disabled culture. I'm part of a lot of cultures that privilege me. And my ability to reflect on those is going to make me a better leader for people who have different identities, for people who have different experiences. And so cultural awareness, a lot of times people think that it starts with, if you're cisgender, reading books and watching media that's developed by trans voices. And yes, that's good. That's great. Or if you're a white person, reading books by Black authors and Latin authors and indigenous authors, etc. And yes, that is good. Those are all good. But fundamentally, I think one of the things is, starting off when it comes to cultural awareness, is sort of knowing who you are and knowing what cultures you're part of. So one of the examples I use in the book is, oftentimes when we're doing improv, we'll ask the audience for name a career, name a place in the world, name some accents, and our coach will give us accents. By the way, it's funny. I think on my mom's side, I think I'm Irish. But the accents I'm worst at are Irish and Scottish. But my coach, Jenny, when she would do games, would sometimes give me Scottish and Irish because it was just fun to watch me squirm, right? But when asking for accents, and I talk about this in the book a little bit, the improv troupe I was part of reflected my city roughly. It was a little less racially diverse than my city, but the improv troupe was, probably about 65% white people, and then probably about 25% Black people, and then maybe, I don't know, I'm not good at math, was that like 10% maybe Latin and Asian folks, right? But usually not that many Asian folks, not that many Latin folks, usually a lot of white folks and a lot of Black folks, which is kind of similar to the makeup of the city where we are. When my coach is out there getting accent suggestions, and they're like, give me some accents. Okay, Boston, cool. Southern, great. British, great. Norwegian, great. And then someone's like Chinese, she's like, okay, I'm going to write that down, but she's not going to use that. She's not going to give that to us because she understands that if any of us on that stage coming from our cultures try to do that accent, it's going to come across poorly. It's going to come across as very racist. And so understanding your own culture is helpful in understanding how you navigate cross-cultural awareness. Team first, don't go for the glory. I've seen improvisers at that comedy club. I don't think I was this person because I don't think I thought I was funny enough for this. But I know some people in improv scenes, they're constantly going for the joke instead of trying to make the team better. I was always trying to make the team better, but at the same time, I just wasn't all that good at getting on the same page. And I had my own problems. But going for the glory is something that happens in leadership when it comes to egos. And it's something that happens sometimes in improv when someone's like, I'm going to throw this scene under the bus so I can get one quick laugh on this thing that's going to not take the scene forward, but it's going to be funny for the audience after your joke that you've made sort of at the expense of the group's goal, right? And the group's goal is creating an effective world that the audience buys into so they can laugh at us in that world, right? Chapter 4 is more about this, but it's also about shared expectations. In a lot of the leadership development I do, I work with organizations on how do they create shared expectations, going back to what is professional and what's not professional. If you have 100 staff members, you have 100 opinions on what professional is, but you can sit down together with the smelly markers and the paper and say, what do we expect of each other in this workplace? What do we expect of each other on this shift if we're on second shift? What do we expect of each other in the C-suite if we're a bunch of vice presidents? A lot of organizations will do shared value statements, and that's great. I applaud that. But shared values can mean lots of things to lots of people. Shared expectations are what behaviors do we expect of each other? And so that process of shared expectations and the process of building a scene has so much rich context that I'm able to pull out in chapter 4. Chapter 5 is about that leadership presence piece. And again, it's interesting because you'll notice the third bullet point there. It says it's not about acting. That embodied leadership or leadership presence isn't something you can fake. It's not something you can fake. People who follow you, they know when you're faking. And so particularly in the social media world, when people are barraged every day with the inauthentic, and now with AI crafted social media, the inauthentic. Authenticity means you've got to do the inner work too. You can't just check the boxes and speak like other leaders speak. You have to be working on yourself and thinking about yourself and reflecting and growing and developing in the way other leaders grow and develop. And so chapter 5 is all about that. So I realize it is 12:57, and thank you for hanging on there. I know my voice is not great today. I don't know if anybody has any questions in the chat. I've got sort of 2 chats open right now. And so if anybody has any questions or comments, especially on the LinkedIn side, those chats come through very quickly. If you're watching me on Facebook Live, you can also leave a comment. Sometimes those have a little bit of a delay though. But I encourage you to get the book. Get the book. It's going to be shipping out within the next few weeks. And it's the other neat thing about this book is that I thought about all the different talented people I had done improv with, and I created pseudonyms for them and created a troupe, right? And this troupe has these people, and each of these improvisers is someone who I really, really admire for their skill, their talent, how graceful they are, how they treated me when I first joined the group. But the talent is unbelievable. And so each chapter, and in some cases, each section of a chapter starts with an improv scene. And I describe an improv scene. And so sometimes the improv scenes go really, really well. And then we look at the leadership lessons. We examine the leadership lessons. Sometimes the improv scenes go off the rails and we look at the lessons we can get from that. And then sometimes they go off the rails and then figure out a way to get back. And those are some of the great lessons as well. So if you haven't gotten a copy of my book yet, adaptivechallengeconsulting.com. If you go to adaptivechallengeconsulting.com, then you can go to the Knowledge Center, and it's right there. And so, check out the book. It's something that, again, this book sort of wrote itself, and it wrote itself because I've been employing these techniques for the better part of 10 years, and to actually get to sit down and unpack them and compare everything I've learned about improv comedy, being in the troupe, teaching it at the college level. I taught that improv comedy class at that college, I think for 5 or 6 years. So when you teach it, you have to. I think I'm better at teaching improv than doing improv, because also I get more confidence when I know I'm the person in the room that knows the most about improv. Sometimes when I'm with the troupe, my confidence is shot because I'm looking at these brilliant other people and I'm like, oh my gosh, if I'm not that brilliant, I can't participate, and that trips me up sometimes. And so I think that I found that I was actually better at teaching it than I was at doing it, which is a little weird, but because I get to teach it at my own pace, right? And so anyway, so if you get a chance, get the book, and if you have questions, also, shameless plug, if you are thinking that your organization wants some professional development, and maybe you don't want to do improv because sometimes that will scare people on your team away, but maybe you want some leadership development around personality type or communication or creating shared expectations or just leadership development in general, bringing someone in who has an improv background can help make the learning environment that much more supportive, that much more aware of audience. And so I understand that, again, doing work with introverts and extroverts, I just did a workshop for a law office out in California, and we talked about extroversion and introversion. We broke the room in half, and it was 24 people with introvert preferences and 4 with extrovert preferences. And so if they had said, hey, team, we're going to bring in an improv comedian and we're going to do some improv comedy, I'm pretty sure that, number one, everyone in the room would feel some anxiety, but people with introvert preferences might feel extra anxiety, and you're not going to learn when you're feeling anxiety. So that's all to say that if you don't want to bring me in for an improv workshop, that is okay. But if you and your team are looking for some leadership development work, some communication work, some leading with personality type awareness, some leading with cross-cultural awareness, um, bring me in, and you'll get some of the improv, whether you think you're getting improv or not, without me putting people on the spot saying, hey, do you want to play an improv game today? Anyway, thank you all so much for hanging out. This was great. And if you have any questions or comments, or if you want to connect with me, send me an email if you have questions about the book. But thank you for attending today. I really appreciate it.